Ambassador for the Dartmouth Political Union. On behalf of the DPU, I'd like to welcome you to The Merits of DEI Policy, a debate on diversity policies in America. Founded in 2018, the Dartmouth Political Union is Dartmouth's preeminent, nonpartisan, student-led political organization dedicated to fostering open discourse and challenging preconceptions. To this end, we host speakers from across the political spectrum, organize both student and expert debates, and hold campus-wide discussions on the issues that matter most. Our event tonight is the third in a series of expert debates, the DPU Debate Series, Critical Discourse in the Age of Disagreement, which will take place throughout this academic year. This series tackles some of the most pressing and controversial topics facing our nation and world, fostering respectful conversations about the issues that truly matter. This initiative has been brought to campus with the support of the Office of the President and Dartmouth Dialogues. Tonight's event would not have been possible without the support of our donors and the Office of Student Life, particularly President Bylock, Senior Advisor Drynan, and Assistant Dean McKenna. Thank you. Before introducing our moderator and debaters, I'd like to share the results of a poll conducted with the in-person audience following the Monk debate format. 57.9% of you believe that DEI policies are an appropriate way of addressing inequality in America, while 21.1% say no, and 21.1% are unsure. Furthermore, 89.5% of you are open to reconsidering your position. We will poll the audience again at the end of the debate to see if anyone's mind has changed. Now, for the reason that you all are here, we have two student moderators. First, we have Margaret De La Fuente, Membership Director of the Dartmouth Political Union and member of the Dartmouth Class of 2027, studying Government and Geography. We also have Alexander Barrow, an Ambassador for the Dartmouth Political Union and a member of the Class of 2027, studying History and Philosophy. Keith Boykin is a political commentator, author, and activist known for his work on race, politics, and LGBTQ+ issues, a Dartmouth 87 and Harvard Law graduate. Boykin served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton and was a key figure in shaping policies on diversity and inclusion. His career spans journalism, academia, and public speaking, where he provides sharp analysis on contemporary social and political issues. With multiple books to his name, including Race Against Time and Beyond the Down Low, Boykin has established himself as a leading voice in conversations about racial justice and LGBTQ+ rights. Beyond his political work, Boykin is a familiar face on television, offering commentary on major networks such as CNN and MSNBC. As a co-founder of the National Black Justice Coalition, he has championed the rights of Black LGBTQ+ individuals, highlighting the intersections of race, sexuality, and social justice. Ian Rowe is an educator, author, and social entrepreneur dedicated to empowering young people through education and personal agency. A graduate of Cornell University and Harvard Business School, Rowe has held leadership roles in various organizations focused on education reform, including serving as the CEO of Public Prep, a network of charter schools in New York City, and the current CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based international baccalaureate high school inaugurated in the Bronx in 2022. He is a vocal advocate for a values-based approach to education, emphasizing family structure, personal responsibility, and upward mobility as key factors in student success. Through his writing and public speaking, Rowe challenges conventional narratives on race, inequality, and opportunity, offering alternative solutions grounded in resilience and self-determination. Beyond his work in education, Rowe is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he conducts research on social mobility and economic empowerment. He is the author of Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power, in which he promotes a framework for young people to take control of their futures. Through his work, he continues to inspire and equip the next generation with the tools to achieve success, regardless of background or circumstance. Please join me in giving Margaret, Alexander, Ian Rowe, and Keith Boykin a warm welcome.
Great, thank you, Pari. We understand that with current changes to DEI policies, this issue can be very personal, and we want to approach it with sensitivity. However, there are legitimate debates that arise with any policy question, and we hope to dive further into those tonight. So now, getting into the debate, let's outline the rules. This will be similar to a presidential town hall where both Mr. Rowe and Mr. Boykin get 3 minutes for their initial response, and will each get a 1-minute rebuttal. So ideally, each question should last around 8 minutes, but we will see how we do with managing our time. Okay, so before we get into the formal structure, to establish a baseline for this debate, we would like to ask you both very briefly, how do you define DEI? Mr. Rowe, you may begin.
3 minutes.
Briefly, but yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here. It's great to be with you, Keith. As the introduction, for the last 15 years, I have run public charter schools in the Bronx, educating thousands of low-income Black and Hispanic students, presumably the audience that many DEI policies would be intended to help. I'm here to say that I'm very committed to these issues, and unfortunately, as currently constructed, many DEI policies hurt, certainly more than they help. So I think it's important to understand what are the flawed belief systems that I think have contributed to why DEI policies have not generally worked, and why I think the DEI spell has finally now been broken by so many fair-minded Americans. The first, what I call the sort of four false pillars of DEI. First is this idea that America is a fundamentally racist or oppressive nation. Just 3 weeks ago, the journal Education Next released a survey of high school students where they asked, what messages have you heard over the last 4 years? And 70% of high school students reported that their teachers say that, quote, America is a fundamentally racist nation, end quote, with nearly 40% of students saying they hear that message often or almost daily. The second false pillar, I'd say, is that DEI operates at what I call the identity group level. So race or class or sexual orientation, not at the individual level. And when you operate at the group level, it carries these stereotypes of oppressor versus oppressed. The third pillar, I'd say, which is a flawed, is this: anytime we see disparities in outcomes by these groups, we attribute those disparities to discrimination within that group. So if there are educational outcomes, difference in readings between Black and white students, absent any other factors, the causality is normally, it must be due to racial discrimination. And I think that really hurts when we're really trying to figure out how to improve outcomes for all kids. And then the final flaw, I think, in the DEI is this idea that once you have this framework where you see the world through the prism of these structural barriers, structural discrimination, all the solutions are either typically race-based, or there has to be proportional representation, there has to be equality of outcome at the group level versus equality of opportunity at the individual level. And I'm looking forward to talking more of how I think this mode of thinking leads to interventions that, in my view, actually do not accrue to the benefit of kids.
Thank you. So do I get 3 minutes, or do I do a 1 minute response?
Briefly, just, you have 3 minutes though.
Okay, all right, wasn't sure. I think you're not hooked up, Ian. Okay, all right. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you all for coming here today. I start by telling you a little bit about myself. I am obviously a Dartmouth graduate from 1987, and the reason why I'm was able to be a Dartmouth graduate is because of DEI, and not in the way you think. First, because my father was a member of the military. He served in the armed forces, and the reason why he was able to do that is because Harry Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948, which was a form of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. My mom worked in the federal government for decades in the Department of Defense, and she did defense procurement. And she was able to get that job because of DEI, because Lyndon Johnson signed Executive Order 11246 in 1965, which opened up the federal workforce. So there was no racial discrimination for federal employees and federal contractors. My grandmother worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development for decades. She got that job because of DEI. So all those things opened up the door so that I could actually have a middle-class lifestyle as a child. Then, the reason why I was able to come to Dartmouth in the final point, why I came here was because Dartmouth recruited me. Dartmouth recruited me based on my PSAT scores, my preliminary SAT scores. I'd never heard of Dartmouth before that time. And part of what diversity is, part of what DEI is recruiting people. I think people have this fundamental misconception of what DEI is. So let me just tell you, first of all, it's diversity, equity, inclusion. Diversity is about having different people in different types of backgrounds. Equity is about making sure that there is fairness. And inclusion is making sure that people feel welcome. That's all it is. I don't know anybody who's really opposed to diversity, equity, or inclusion when you just give them those words. But we've kind of twisted it into being something else. I don't know if I can, in 1 minute and 4 seconds, explain what the eight points of the DEI are in the federal government, but I'll try to do it real quickly. There are 8 components of the federal DEI program. One, the first is data collection. That's just getting information so we know who's there and who's not there. The second is paid internships, making sure you get people an opportunity to get into the door. The third is recruitment, which is how I got to Dartmouth, because they recruited me. The fourth is professional development, making sure once people get into the workplace or wherever they are, they have the skills to be able to do the job. The fifth is opportunities for people with disabilities, which is critically important because we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed by George Bush in 1990. The sixth is opportunities for LGBTQ people, which is important because that's a group of people who have never been included in the past. The seventh is opportunities for people who have been formerly incarcerated, which is something I think most people would agree is pretty important. And then the eighth is pay equity, to make sure people aren't doing the same job and getting paid different things. Those are the 8 components of DEI at the federal government. Nothing about that has anything to do with treating people differently or unfairly. It's all about giving people equal access who haven't been included in the past. So I'm 2 seconds over, but I'm finished.
Great. So now we're going to take a look at the origins of DEI initiatives in recent years, that is. The recent shift seems to be driven by the BLM movement. So this raises the question, does systemic racism exist in the United States? And if so, are DEI initiatives an effective way to address it? We'll start with you, Mr. Boykin.
It's interesting because I don't actually think that the DEI began because of Black Lives Matter. It actually started decades before that. But I mean, you could actually trace it back at least to John F. Kennedy, if not before, with his executive orders banning discrimination in the workplace in the federal government. But I think the question that you're getting at is whether there is systemic racism in the country. And I noticed that Ian I think he was saying it's not a fundamentally racist country. I just disagree with that. I mean, I don't really know how to convince people that my lived experience is real, but my lived experience says that racism is a core part of who we are as a country. The fact that, since we're in a political event, normally I avoid politics, but I'll say it here. The fact that Donald Trump, who was the first person ever in history to be elected president of the United States with no military government experience, was able to do so. He was only able to do that because he was a white guy, a rich white guy at that. There's never been any other person in the history of this country who ever got elected president of the United States with no experience in government and military until Donald Trump came along. And the reason why he became a popular avatar of that message is because he started out his career by attacking Barack Obama, the first black president. The whole reason why we have a backlash against DEI is largely because people don't like the idea we had a black president. That's essentially very much the core of what racism is all about in this country. And some people say, well, we have a black president, so how can we be racist? Well, the truth is, the majority of white voters didn't vote for Barack Obama. In fact, the majority of white voters voted for Donald Trump in each of his 3 elections, but they didn't vote for Barack Obama in either of his 2 elections. And to take it even further, no Democratic candidate for president has ever won the white vote since 1964 when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Why did all these white voters who were voting for Democrats for a century suddenly abandon the Democratic Party after 1964? Clearly, America is a racist country. It has always been a racist country. It was founded on racism. It says in the Declaration of Independence, there are racist words that the way we describe Native Americans in the Declaration of Independence is racist. This college, founded in 1769, for 200 years didn't graduate more than 10 Native American students. Why is that? I mean, part of what DEI forces us to do is to look at the history that we don't want to talk about. The reality that we kind of sweep under the rug and pretend that all these things are actually much better than they really are. It's just forcing us to be honest and have a critical analysis and not to pretend that the reality doesn't exist. I'm only stopping because I'm at 15 seconds left, but I could go on for more. I feel like I'm constrained with these things, but
Yeah.
I'm trying.
And
1 minute?
3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes, okay. So there's no question that our country has a history marked by racism, and it's very important that our students know the entire history of our country, warts and all. I think the question that we have to deal with today is how much is racism that certainly still exists, but how much is it the factor that is so debilitating that it drives the outcomes that we see? I'm very empathetic to the fact that there are real disparities in our country, often along racial lines, class lines. You know, I run schools, so, you know, in 2015, when you looked at black fourth grade reading outcomes, only 18% of all black fourth graders were reading at grade level. In 2019, that same cohort at the 8th grade level, only 15% was reading at grade level. 4 years later, that same cohort, now at 12th grade graduating, less than 20% were reading at grade level. So, you know, and by the way, to the extent, there's also never been a year in which there's been a majority of white students. So the National Assessment for Educational Progress that's given every 2 years has been testing students since 1992. There's never been a year in which a majority of white students are reading at grade level. So even if we actually achieve this idea of closing the racial achievement gap in reading between black and white, all we would have achieved is universal mediocrity. So what that indicates to me is that there are forces beyond just race that we really have to look at that helps to explain why kids of all races are not doing well. And that has to do with things like lack of access to high-quality schools. In the district that I'm in, there's a cap on charter schools. It's a district in which only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. And if you had an idea to launch a great school in this community, you couldn't do it because of that legislative barrier. Other reasons that we know, certainly someone running schools, the shift in family structure over time certainly has had a huge impact on the kinds of support that kids get. And then even on a very practical level, number of hours spent studying. Like, these are actual real data that you can tie to achievement in school. And so I'm very empathetic to how we need to address the fact that all kids in our society are not succeeding. The issue with DEI is that when you get mesmerized by a theory that says the only causality is the history, in this case of racial discrimination, it obscures our ability to find all these other very important interventions that if we focused on, I think would increase outcomes for kids of all races.
Do I respond to that?
And your rebuttal, yes.
I think what you're doing is you're making this fundamental flaw in your reasoning, which is conflating DEI with race. And as I pointed out with those 8 different components in the federal DEI initiatives, it has nothing, it's not nothing to do, but race is not the primary focal point of DEI. It is about diversity in general, writ large. It's about the idea of having different people from different backgrounds, about women and people of color and LGBTQ people and people with disabilities. That's all of what it's about, but you're fixated on this issue of race. And I'm not. I mean, I think race is critically important that we understand that. And I think America has racial issues that need to be dealt with. But the reality is there are issues of disparity that can't be rectified with just sort of treating people equally. And one of those issues I just want to mention from an article that appeared in the Boston Globe in 2015. The average net worth of white households in Boston was $247,000. But for black households, it was only $8. I had to stop.
Well, that's a good, because I've done a lot of analysis on this. When you look, like for example, the Survey of Consumer Finances, which every couple of years assesses the amount of basically the wealth gap, it's true. In 2019, if you look at the average wealth, the wealth of the average white family, it's about $160,000 more than the wealth of the average black family. When you look at race alone, that's what the data says. So it's a true disparity. However, if you just take into account two other factors, family structure and level of education, this relationship is completely reversed. The average wealth of the average married, college-educated black family is about $160,000 more than the wealth of the average single white parent family. The reason that's important, certainly from someone who runs schools, I want our students to know that there are levers in their control that are far more determinative than their race.
Thank you.
Is that the end of that?
You'll get another
Okay,
chance
all
to
right.
address this throughout the debate, but we're going to move on to our next question.
Okay.
So in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, a series of executive orders have specifically targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion. According to the ACLU, President Trump's actions were a deliberate effort to obfuscate and weaponize civil rights laws that address discrimination. Mr. Rowe, how would you respond to this characterization?
I mean, he's clearly implementing a very blunt approach, and certainly he issued an edict to K-12 schools across the country. They have 2 weeks to eliminate all DEI-related initiatives, and otherwise they risk federal funding. So it's certainly a blunt instrument. You know, my view on this is that there have been practices that I think are not in line with what is in the best interest of students. I'll give you an example. In certain districts across the country, there have been these things called privilege walks. And these privilege walks have been designed to essentially help young people and faculty understand their privilege, their inherent privilege, or their inherent oppression. So imagine a classroom like this, where a group of 12-year-olds are asked to line up in a horizontal line, and then the teacher gives a series of instructions. So if you're black, take 5 steps backwards. If you're white, take 2 steps forward. And there are a series of questions like this, not just based on race, by the way, but this idea that it's all sort of a proxy, depending on if you're in this oppressed group, whether it be race or sexual orientation, you're moving up or back. And at the end of this exercise, as you might imagine, at the end of it, you have white men at the front of the class, you have typically kids of color, and I've seen this, and it's one of these practices that maybe they're well-intended, but it's the kind of DEI practice that actually helps reify divisions, right? It actually reinforces this idea that you're either inherently part of this oppressed class or the oppressor class. Those kinds of activities, I think, should be eliminated, along with all the other kinds of things that typically fall under the DEI category. So you've got race-based professional development. I've seen it all over the country where teachers were separated by race or presumed privilege based on, again, these superficial characteristics. And I hear you, it's not just about race. It's all of these identity group categorizations. So I think if those are the kinds of things that are eliminated, I think that's good, because once again, none of these things that I've just described do anything to improve reading outcomes for kids of all races.
Is this a rebuttal or
You have 3 minutes to respond to Mr. Rowe's points.
Well, I'll respond and then sort of answer your question as well. I think what you're doing is argument by anecdote. Yes, there are examples of diversity practices that may be problematic for some people, and I don't dispute that. And maybe some are not effective, and I don't dispute that either. But that doesn't mean that the concept of DEI as a whole is problematic. It just means that in some instances, some people may not be taking the right approach. And there's a number of studies, including a study that just came out from the Harvard Business Review last year, I think 2 years ago, that indicated that the 16 different mechanisms that employers tend to use in the workplace, I think 8 or 10 of them are effective, and another 6 or so are not as effective. And some of them are actually counterproductive, like diversity trainings, for example. That seems to turn people off more than anything else. And I acknowledge that. But that's not what DEI is, and that's what people have conflated it to. People think DEI is just, we're gonna force everybody to sit in a room, and whether you like it or not, we're gonna make you feel bad and guilty about who you are because of your privilege. That's not DEI. DEI is about diversity, equity, inclusion. And those things you're talking about, those are mere tactics or strategies in order to get to the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, DEI, most importantly, is an aspiration. It's not an action. It's something that I think most people in this room probably agree, and maybe you probably agree with as well, that it's a good thing to have different types of people in a room. It's a good thing not for everyone to be the same. It's a good thing not to have homogeneity. I think most people agree that equity is a good thing. It's a good thing to have fairness in the way we treat each other. I think most people think it's a good thing to have inclusion. You don't want to be in a room where all of us are together and this one guy over there can't be in the conversation. That's not inclusive. Nobody likes that. So we understand that, but what happens is that we take this DEI principle and we cherry pick these little isolated examples to prove that this whole thing is wrong. And I think that's just a very problematic way to approach this question. I just want to go back now to the Trump part of it. I just have to say this because, Donald Trump talks a lot about meritocracy, but he's appointed the least meritocratic people in government in any administration in history. J.D. Vance just got elected, just became a U.S. Senator 2 years ago. He was elected last year. He'd only been in the U.S. Senate for 1 year, became Vice President of the United States. And they were talking about Kamala Harris not being qualified. I mean, Pete Hegseth, he's a former Fox News host. And now he's the Secretary of Defense, replacing a four-star general, a black four-star general. I mean, Linda McMahon, she's a wrestling CEO. How does it qualify her to be the head of the Department of Education? And RFK Jr., he's a conspiracy theorist who has no qualifications. Somebody just died of measles today. And this guy is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And so when Donald Trump talks about meritocracy and qualifications, what he's really saying is we want white people. We don't want black people. We don't want Hispanic people. We don't even want women unless they follow our very narrow agenda, very conservative agenda of what we believe.
Mr. Rowe, your response?
1 minute.
1 minute.
So just to respond to your concern that I was cherry picking negative examples, I would say it's more representative, but I'm certainly open to hear what good DEI looks like. But I would give you examples of something that's happening all across the country in almost all states that I do think is inspired by DEI type thinking, which is that in almost every state there's usually an assessment that a high school senior has to take to demonstrate that they're proficient in reading and math to earn their graduation. And over the last few years, New York is now going to fall as well, Massachusetts has. They've eliminated that assessment because of the dissatisfaction with representation of Black and Hispanic students. And so rather than really understand, well, what are the factors driving low performance, let's just get rid of the assessment. And in New Jersey, I mean, that is amazing. New Jersey Board of Education, they changed what's considered the cut score, the passing score, that a high school student had to demonstrate to show proficiency in reading and math. Under the prior passing score, only 39% of students would have been able to demonstrate that they were graduation ready. Under the new cut score, it leapt to 80% in reading. That's not helping kids. That is a false modification to create some numerical outcome when the reality is the vast majority of those kids of all races are not reading and not prepared to leave high school.
Mr. Boykin, you have 1 minute.
I'm not sure where to begin with this one, but because it seems to me that the examples you're mentioning, you're an educator, so you're focusing on education examples. I understand that. But it doesn't necessarily prove, again, the point that I'm making, that means that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives need to be discontinued, or to answer the question of the debate, I'm not sure if it's up there, but is DEI an appropriate strategy still in order to deal with the issues that we're facing in America? And all I hear from what you're saying from the examples is that there are problems in the way we administer some questions about diversity in the educational sphere. But what they're doing, and I don't know how it's being implemented in New Jersey or in a particular place, but I think what they're doing is the purpose is to try to force us to consider which qualifications are really relevant and which are not. And I don't know if that's effective in that case, because it seems like if you have people who are unqualified who can't read, obviously that's not a good thing. I'm not going to disagree with that. But I think there are some standards that have been set up in the past that don't necessarily go to your judgment of your ability. And so we have to sort of reconsider how we approach that.
We're moving on to
We're moving on to the next question.
Okay.
So,
You got to write it down so you can remember what to come back to the next time.
so in reaction to President Trump's return to office, many companies, including Meta, Amazon, and Walmart, have backtracked corporate DEI policies. Should private companies be allowed to use DEI initiatives to ensure a diverse workforce? And do you believe there are merits to diversity in corporate spaces? Mr. Boykin, you can begin.
Should they be allowed to?
Yes.
Absolutely. This is America. Why should they not be allowed to? I think diversity, equity, and inclusion are important initiatives, important goals and values, and I applaud those businesses that continue to stick by that. Apple just had a meeting this week with its shareholders, and they rejected an anti-DEI initiative. Ben & Jerry's continues to support DEI. Microsoft supports DEI still. JP Morgan Chase still supports DEI. There are a number of companies that have, Delta Airlines, other companies that have still stuck by their DEI programs in spite of the onslaught from the Trump administration. But yes, it's important for the business world, because in the business community, the studies indicate that companies that actually value diversity tend to perform better than companies that don't value diversity. And the employees tend to have a greater job satisfaction when they actually work in an environment where they feel like they're welcomed and included because of diversity. So I think there's a positive impact for the business as well. And it's not just charity. It's not like they're doing this because they want to help people. I go back to one of my law professors, Derek Bell, who's one of the founders of the critical race theory movement, but he created a theory called the interest convergence theory back in 1980 in a famous Harvard Law Review article. And he talked about this idea that I applied to businesses, but he was talking about race, that businesses will only do the right thing when it suits their economic interest. They're not going to do it because it's some sort of altruistic reason. And the reason why those companies have chosen to stick with DEI is because they realize it makes sense to do that. It makes sense for them as a business to do that. Just think about something that just happened a few weeks ago. I don't know if any of you saw the Grammys. But during the Grammys, there was an interview with two AP reporters, two white women, who were interviewing Babyface, who was a black male R&B artist. And I don't think they knew who Babyface was, but he's a legendary African-American recording artist, and they were in the middle of an interview, and they saw Chappell Roan. And they stopped the interview to go and talk to Chappell Roan instead, because I guess she's more popular. I don't even know Chappell Roan. I didn't know her until then. But the fact that I don't know her, and they do, and they don't know Babyface is a part of the problem. You can't, no one group of people has a monopoly on knowledge. That's the reason why we have different groups of people in a room, so that one person will be able to see something the other person can't see. So if you have a blind spot, this other person can figure out what to do and what not to do. That's why diversity is important in the corporate space as well. And companies that do that recognize that, don't have those problems as often as companies that don't include that.
Yeah, I would, three or one? Three?
Yeah.
Okay. If you're the CEO of a company, any rising organization, you want to ensure the people in your company are, well prepared, well-resourced, represent lots of different elements of diversity, whether that be race, gender, viewpoint diversity. I think the question is, where does this rub up against discriminatory laws, right? So that if companies are setting, as some companies have done, set specific quotas, again, by identity group, whether it's by race or gender, then that runs into U.S. constitutional law, even for private companies. So I think that's the Rob, and what is interesting is that you're right that a number of companies over the last few years have gravitated to create DEI policies, and a lot of that was motivated by a study that was done by McKinsey Consulting a few years ago, where McKinsey put out a report which said that DEI policy, typically led to greater productivity and profitability. Well, last year, the Wall Street Journal and a number of academics, many different institutions have tried to replicate the outcomes of that study. And basically, quote, academics have tried to repeat McKinsey's findings and failed, concluding that there is in fact no link between profitability and executive diversity, end quote. And in fact, the findings have said companies that were already profitable were more likely to take on diversity initiatives. So, you mentioned it earlier, like mandatory diversity trainings, I think there has been a backlash. So I think, again, for a company, like for example, I run schools, and so our faculty, I want to ensure that our teachers are well-versed in their subject matter, right, that they are strong in their pedagogical practice, and we also want to know that if I looked at my entire population of teachers, that they are understanding of the conditions of where our schools are, the likely circumstances of our students. So there's an awareness of the kids that you're teaching, but no one person is going to represent all of that, right? So you want to ensure that every teacher has the subject matter knowledge, has the pedagogical knowledge, and that as a full cohort of faculty is representative in terms of viewpoint, race, gender, with our students. But I think we can do that without fearing, that we're violating some kind of Title VI, violation of civil rights laws.
Yeah, one
Just a few quick studies here, since you mentioned studies. Boston Consulting Group study revealed that organizations with above average diversity in management generate 19% higher revenue from innovation. A Harvard Business Review analysis found that inclusive workplaces lead to higher employment, engagement, and retention. It's not just the McKinsey study. There are other studies that have come to similar conclusions. And McKinsey didn't just do one study. They did several studies that have come up with that result as well. Just getting back to the question of the workplace, though, I don't think there's any doubt that this is beneficial to the workplace, and I don't think there's any illegal issue involved, even though the current administration is trying to make this an issue. Businesses exist to create profit. They don't exist to create social change. And the reason why they make these changes, including having diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, is because they realize it's profitable for them to do that. It's not because they feel like they're trying to change the world in some way. I mean, they don't really care. They care about making money, and they've determined that this is actually better for their bottom line.
Rebuttal to that?
Yes.
Again, I think, let's let CEOs make that kind of decision as to, for their particular organization, what's the right composition of their organization that works. I think part of the issue is that when CEOs feel like they're getting mandates, whether it be ESG or DEI type initiatives or quotas, or like I think California passed a law that your boards of directors had to have a certain number of female representatives. It's when it gets into that kind of coercive diversity, and that's usually based on race and gender, that I think that's where you get the kind of conflict and pushback that I think has occurred.
But since you have 16 seconds left, can I ask you a question? Do you have a problem with all the coercion that the Trump administration is engaging in right now to pressure businesses not to do DEI?
Well, again, my sense is the types of DEI that I think would be awry, whomever the president is, of constitutional law would be any kind of forced quotas, ESG type initiatives, DEI initiatives that said, you must have X% race or X% gender. I think United Airlines last year explicitly said we're shooting for X% of gender roles. I think it's that kind of quota type system that runs into legal challenges.
I know we're off, but I feel like I want to press on this a bit because I don't think those are quotas. Those are goals. And those goals are, women are the majority of the population in this country. We've never had a woman president in this country. 57% of CEOs are white men. Even today, after all the DEI, 57% of CEOs are white men in Fortune 500 companies. White men are 30% of the population. 30% of the population, completely overrepresented in every major sector of our society, including among the presidents, of course. Every president except one has been a white man. And women are the majority of the population. I think the thing that's going on here is that people are looking at the demographics of society, and they say, well, if women are 51% of the population, African Americans are 13 or 14% of the population, the Latino population is growing, Asian American population is growing, and these people aren't included in our spaces, in our decision-making places. Maybe we should try to get some more of them in there. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's a quota. A quota is saying we have to have this person here or that person here. And another example of a quota is the identity politics that Republicans play when they pick somebody who happens to fill a quota because the black person was there before. So when Raphael Warnock was a senator, ran for re-election, they picked Herschel Walker, who was completely unqualified because he was a black guy. They picked him out of Texas. When Barack Obama ran for Senate, they got Alan Keyes out of Maryland to come to Illinois to run against Barack Obama. When the legendary Thurgood Marshall retired from the Supreme Court, they got an unqualified Clarence Thomas to come replace him. When Hillary Clinton, in 2008, got 18 million votes, they picked Sarah Palin, who was clearly unqualified to be the vice presidential nominee for John McCain. Over and over again, Republicans play this game of identity politics, and this is why I think they really believe that DEI is about picking unqualified people, because that's what they do. They pick unqualified women and people of color, and they think that's what everybody else is doing.
So we're gonna go to a brief response from you, and then we're gonna
Sorry,
get back to our. It happens.
Well, what I'd say is I think one of the flaws I mentioned in DEI philosophy, which I think hurts, is this idea there must be proportional representation. That we have X% of blacks or women in the population, so therefore there must be that same representation in companies. And again, a CEO's got to make a decision. Does that contribute to that person's ability to be a great engineer or to be a great pilot or to great anything? And I think when we're forcing companies to do things that are not actually in line with necessarily what is best for the best product or service, that hurts. And then let me just also say, the reason I run schools is I think all of this is a big distraction. Less than 20% of black kids coming out of 12th grade are reading at grade level. Only 35, 38% of white kids are reading at grade level coming out of our K-12 system. We spend so much time arguing about why don't we have equal representation? Well, why would we expect there would be equal representation? We have such low percentages of kids coming out of our public school system. And for me, I wish we would spend as much time focused on why we don't have enough talent broadly distributed to fill all of these great roles as adults.
I agree.
Great. So our next question for Mr. Rowe, in your book, Agency, you discuss how family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship are the path for children to, quote, overcome the victimhood narrative. Can you expand on this framework and how it differs from the DEI policies we have seen introduced in recent years?
Well, thanks for the question. So, I've been working in the Bronx, and over 30 years, I've worked with every kind of kid: rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, kids growing up in homeless shelters, kids experiencing domestic violence. And I've been in this work long enough now to see kids, as they make their decisions, as they enter young adulthood, unfortunately recreate the same disadvantage that they experienced growing up. So that cycle of deprivation just continues. And yet I've seen other kids in those same exact conditions, those same exact challenges, make different sets of decisions to put them on a different trajectory for their life. And the animating question of my life has become, what makes the difference? Right? What is it that those kids were able to experience growing up that helped them to have a future orientation, to have a different vision for what they could accomplish. And in my view, most of those young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage had a sense of personal agency, that they had a belief that they could lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose. But this sense of agency didn't just come from nowhere. It's not like they just pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. In my view, there are 4 pillars that these young people interacted with, or family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Family, the first, regardless of the dysfunction that a young person may have faced in their own life, in their own family, it wasn't about the family that they were from, it's about the family that they were on the pathway to form, which is why we teach something in our schools called the success sequence, which data that says if you finish just your high school degree, get a full-time job of any kind, so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, marriage first, that series of decisions in that order, education, work, marriage, and children, 97% of young people avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. We teach that in our schools for our young people to think about family formation and the responsible way to do it. Religion, the young people I've seen break the cycle of disadvantage, typically lived by some kind of moral code. They had a personal faith commitment. They were part of a community of people. It didn't matter if it was Christianity, Buddhism, almost didn't matter, but that they were part of a community of people that expected them to live up to this moral code. The third element, E, in education, young people able to break the cycle of disadvantage usually benefited from some kind of educational freedom or school choice. They could go to the school that their family thought was best for them. And finally, they had what I call an entrepreneurial mindset, an overcomer's mindset, that when inevitable challenges came, they had strategies and networks that they could fall back onto. So this framework of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship, my hope is that is an empowering framework that we can help young people see what is in their control to lead the life that they want.
And Mr. Boykin, what do you believe Mr. Rowe's framework might be lacking that DEI initiatives may better account for?
Well, I don't see this as an either-or question. I mean, I don't dispute the data, the research that Ian has come up with in terms of what works in his settings. But what I do find a bit more troubling is this notion that may be the only way. I don't think that there is one solution to everyone's problems. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. I do think that socioeconomic conditions play an enormous role in terms of the success of people educationally. And I also think that socioeconomic conditions are very closely correlated to race in this country. Going back to the initial question about structural racism in the country, the reason why black families, for example, have more challenges is because of history of racism. The reason why black families have more poverty is because of a history of racism. The reason why black families have more unemployment is because of a history of racism. All those issues have an impact on your ability to perform in the classroom. If I'm a high school student or a grade school student and I have to go to work and go to school every day, and my parents are struggling just to get by, as opposed to a family where their parents are actually better off, I have an additional burden to have to compensate for in the classroom. And I shouldn't have to be this exceptional superstar student that Ian wants me to be in order to be able to break out of it. There are a lot of average students, and they should have the ability to be just as successful as other average white students, black or white or Asian or Latino or whatever community you come from. And I think that that's part of the myth that Republicans and conservatives tend to promote, this idea that somehow if you kind of rejected it, but you accepted it at the same time, you pull yourself up from your bootstraps and you find out what makes you tap into that inner entrepreneur. You shouldn't have to be an inner entrepreneur in order just to be successful as a student. Everyone doesn't have that. And for those who do, I applaud them, but not everyone does. And I want to make sure we have an equitable playing field so everyone has an opportunity to do well. I'll just say this. When I was at Dartmouth, I came here, I was a little intimidated at first because all these smart people, these rich people. I went to school with Michael Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller Jr. And my two roommates in my first year in New Hampshire Hall, one of my roommates was very wealthy from New York, and the other roommate was very wealthy from Highland Park, Illinois. His great-grandfather was the founder of the Spiegel Corporation, which most of you probably don't even know about right now. I'm thinking about because it was a big catalog company back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I feel I had to explain it to you, but back in the day, everybody knew that. And it just occurred to me, after a while, I was realizing, wow, their whole background and their whole lifestyle, everything they learned from the time when they were children was different from my background. I didn't have parents who spoke the Queen's English when I was growing up in my household. I had family members who were incarcerated. I had family members who had to struggle just to survive, to make ends meet. And they didn't have that struggle. So they were able to go to school every day and take their AP courses and honors courses that I did, but they didn't have that additional burden to deal with in their lives that I did. And it wasn't just because of my socioeconomic condition, but also because of my race.
So I would say, so you talk about low-income poor kids, of course. I mean, I run schools, in the Bronx, almost exclusively in low-income communities, right. And we acknowledge it, but for our students, we say that your capacity to overcome these challenges, not on your own, with good schools, good families, good faith-based organizations, you can succeed. And this idea of leading the self-determined life of meaning and purpose, we think is really important. And sometimes the prickly topic that's often not talked about is the role of family structure. We're gathered on the 60th anniversary of the Moynihan Report, which came out in 1965. Many of the students probably here don't know that report, but that was a report that was produced on the state of the black family. And at the time, there was real concern that there was a segment of the black community who, middle class was rising very well, but there was a segment that was declining. And Moynihan did a report that said the non-marital birth rate, family structure, had a huge influence. At that time, the non-marital birth share in the black community was 23.6%. Now it's 70%. That's a huge difference in terms of what that means in the lives of children. And by the way, the non-marital birth share in the white community is now about 30%. It's higher than the crisis levels that were talked about in 1965. So this is an equal opportunity issue. But again, I wish we would talk as much about this issue, a factor that our young people do have in their control, formation of family, and how that is connected to almost all the other social outcomes we're all concerned with.
I don't disagree that family is important structure. I just wish that conservatives would be more open-minded about families, so that it wasn't just a particular type of heteronormative, conservative nuclear family they believe is the one that's right. Because there are other types of family structures that are able to be just as supportive and loving and caring and nurturing for their children. And conservatives tend to ignore that because they want to promote this conservative fantasy that we all have to live in a 1950s style Leave to Beaver version where we make America great again. I think that we can do both. That's the point I keep trying to make over and over again. I mean, I appreciate the fact that you're coming at this entire discussion from the point of view as an educator. And I'm looking at it from a bit broader perspective and also a more political perspective because I'm more concerned about the way these issues are being politicized in our country today. That people are being attacked and vilified because of the assault on DEI in our country. And that young people of color are being attacked because they're not succeeding, as though it's entirely their fault, as opposed to understanding the structural forces at play that contribute to their inability to succeed.
But can I ask you then, so there's definitely, for example, in New York City, where there's a cap on charter schools, that is a real structural barrier that stands in the way of opportunity for a lot of kids, right? Poor kids, black kids, Hispanic kids. But oftentimes the people who are advocating for DEI stand in the way of allowing more kids, more parents, low-income parents, to have the ability to choose a great school for their child?
Well, I'm of mixed minds on this because one of my best friends works for the Center for Charter School Excellence in New York City. And so I'm aware of the work that charter schools do, and I have friends who are charter school principals as well. On the other hand, I'm a proud graduate of a public school. It's not a charter school.
As am I.
And I like the idea of supporting public schools. I don't have a problem with charter schools. The problem I have is with taking funding out of the everyday public schools in order to facilitate the charter schools. If you could make the charter schools and the public schools equally funded, equally resourced, so that the average kid is getting the same benefits and same resources and same services, then I'd support that. But I think you've got to figure out a way, again, going back to the question of equity, to do this in a way that's fair to the people who are in the other schools.
And this is why I think the conversation around DEI almost sucks the air out of the room and our ability to have conversations just like you're talking about. So for example, charter schools are public schools. They're just a different type of public school. And charter schools, on average, receive maybe 70 to 80% per pupil relative to traditional district schools. And so,
but you're able to choose your students in the way that
it's a lottery. It's a lottery.
But still, it's a self-selected group of people, though. The people who apply to the lottery, the people whose parents are already more motivated, who want their kids to succeed. So you're able to choose your students in the way that ordinary public schools cannot. And that, I think, is a distinction that it's not a fair equation. I think a fair comparison.
So when you say,
I know this is not the conversation we're supposed to be
it's
having.
No, but I think it actually is related to DEI, because when you say we want equity, so you've just said, well, these parents, these low-income parents get to enter a lottery and self-select. Well, guess what? Middle and upper-class parents are choosing their schools for their kids. It's the most vulnerable component of our population that doesn't have equity in the way I think that you were defining it. And why wouldn't we want to give more low-income families the opportunity to choose the best school for their child in the same way that every middle and upper class family has that choice today?
I just don't want to deplete the resources of the existing schools in order to create a few good schools. That's all.
So it's okay for middle and upper class kids, but not
No,
low
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying I want old schools to be good, not just some schools to be good.
We'll continue in the vein of education,
Okay.
but shifting back to the questions.
It is DEI related.
Yeah. Great discussion, thank you. So in 2023, the Supreme Court ruled that race-based affirmative action programs in college admissions violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mr. Boykin, do you believe that race-based affirmative action programs have been beneficial to promoting social mobility for racial minorities, and should universities implement policies to adapt for these changes?
Yes, I do think it's beneficial. That's, as I said before, one of the reasons why I was able to go to Dartmouth is because Dartmouth recruited me to come here. And I think that's an important tool in the toolkit for schools to utilize. I know that there's been a mixed bag of results since the 2023 Supreme Court decision. The two schools I know the most about at the upper level are one, Dartmouth, and two, Harvard Law School. At Dartmouth, as I understand it, the number of students who, for example, black students didn't really decline much after affirmative action, after race-based admissions was rejected from the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, that's what I thought. And then at Harvard Law School, on the other hand, there was a significant drop in the law school in terms of the number of black students admitted in the new incoming first-year class that started in the fall. And so I think it's a little too early to figure out exactly what the consequences are going to be, but we saw in California when there was an amendment in the 1990s to ban affirmative action, there was a drop in the University of California school systems in terms of the number of people of color who were admitted in the following years. But ultimately, there's a point I think that's bigger than this. It's not just about numbers, it's about access. What college does is it provides an opportunity for access to other people. You know, when I came here, I started here in August of 1983. I did my freshman trip, and then I started here in 1983 and graduated in 1987. And every student in my class had to read George Orwell's book, 1984, that year. And I haven't read that book in 40 years, I guess, and however many years it's been. And I just went back and read it last week for the first time. And I was remembering what it was like reading it when I was in college and how much I didn't grasp when I was in college that I grasp now. And were it not for Dartmouth, the opportunity that Dartmouth afforded me to be able to come here and to learn from other people and for them to learn from me as well, I don't know that I would have been able to succeed as much. But that's what diversity, equity, inclusion does. You take qualified people, not unqualified people, qualified people, put them in a pool, and let them learn from one another. That's why it's important, especially in the college sphere, more than any place else. We have this notion that somehow we were picking all these unqualified people, but we didn't have a problem with the legacy children coming in or the athletes coming in or the people who gave a lot of money. But it's just when we talk about race, that's when people get upset. And a lot of the DEI, actually, especially when we talk about college admissions, has affected white women, but nobody talks about that. Nobody has a problem with that. It's just the issue of race. And I think that in itself, the way we've narrowly focused our conversation about DEI only to obsess about race, and particularly about black people, reflects just how problematic and racist this whole discussion has become in the course of recent years.
Mr. Rowe, you tweeted about how the overturn of affirmative action got rid of the, quote, terrible stereotype of doubting the qualifications of black students. Can you expand on what you believe the drawbacks are of affirmative action? And do you think affirmative action was ever an effective method of creating opportunities for minority students?
Yeah, so if you look at the Harvard and UNC cases that were up on the Supreme Court, there's no way that one could look at that data objectively and not come to the conclusion that both Harvard and UNC were making decisions in favor of black and Hispanic students and discriminating against white and Asian students. There's just no way to read it without coming to that conclusion. But what I found really interesting was that when you looked at the data for black students that were getting in, 2/3 of them were black students from immigrants, so they're Nigerians, Ghanaians, upper middle class black kids who'd gone to private schools and done quite well. And so you start to think, wait a minute, what is this race-based affirmative action for? Is it for those students or for low-income kids in the Bronx who are striving academically but are now actually getting squeezed out because better prepared black students are actually taking their position? So my feeling is that if we're going to have any kind of preferential status in college admissions, let's make it class-based. You know, I think most Americans would agree that if you've got poor kids of any race that are striving to make it, and they make it academically, let's give them that additional leg up. So I think the Supreme Court made the right decision, the correct decision, to eliminate race-based affirmative action. My hope is that more and more colleges and universities move towards class-based to hopefully to create the same kind of opportunities that you're talking about for all kids who may be economically disadvantaged. And to the point about the perception, there's no question. I went to Harvard Business School, and I remember in my first year, I even wrote an essay about this. You know, 2 second-year black male students were joking about how they got into Harvard Business School, and they were joking, yeah, dude, I'm a diversity admit. And while they were joking, there was something about the way that they said it to each other that you could tell there was almost a sense of self-doubt. I don't want any of the students that come out of our schools to believe that somehow the only reason they got in is because of their skin color. I think that's corrosive. I want all of our students to know that they can compete on equal footing.
For centuries, legions of white people were able to get into this college and to Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School because they were white men. Not because, I mean, they had qualifications, but sometimes they had money. Sometimes they just haven't had the right connections. And they didn't feel any insecurity about being there because they were there just because they had money. But suddenly we're supposed to consider that black people can't be confident in their abilities just because the school might have a program that considers race. But what schools do, and I remember when I was at Dartmouth, I worked with the admissions office here. And I actually, after college, I helped to edit a book called 100 Successful College Application Essays, my first book I worked on. And one of the things I realized from that work back then was that what schools are doing is they're trying to create a well-rounded class. They don't want to create a class of SAT clones and GPA clones. They want to create diversity so people can actually learn from each other. I used to teach at Columbia, and I remember I did a panel once when I was over there, and a student from Alaska, a high school student, asked me whether she should mention her upbringing in Alaska in her essay. I said, yes, absolutely, because that's part of the diversity that they want. They want athletes. They want piano players. They want people from different backgrounds, people from Alaska and Hawaii and from different countries. And they want people from different economic backgrounds. And they want people from different racial backgrounds. Why is it that every other type of diversity is acceptable except race? And race-neutral solutions won't solve the problem alone. If you have a society that's already racially inequitable, and white people, for example, have $100 and black people have $10, and you give everybody $100, then white people are going to have $200 and black people are going to have $110, and you're still going to have racial inequity. You have to deal with the racial problem, not just the class problem. Doesn't mean you don't deal with the class problem, but you have to deal with both. We can't ignore that those racial issues still persist.
We're going to go to your rebuttal, and then
Sorry, that was like a minute over. Nobody stopped me though. Okay.
We're going to go to your rebuttal, Mr. Rowe, and then we're going to start with the audience Q&A.
When I look at the data for black students on the SAT, only 1% to 2% of black students, and this is about the numbers between 170,000 to 200,000 black students take the SAT every year. Only 1% to 2% score between a 1,400 and 1,600, which is usually the range that's needed to get into the top elite schools. Once again, I think this is one of these topics that gets so much airtime when the vast majority of our students are not prepared coming out. And I'm sorry to keep being a broken record, but I think this is an example of how the DEI conversation, again, sucks the air out of the room and distracts us talking about, well, what's the percent drop of kids at MIT versus Yale versus Dartmouth? And yeah, there's been some fluctuation. But the top black students in this country are getting into good schools. They're getting into good schools. The problem is 80% of our kids are not prepared. And that actually goes across race. So I would encourage us to continue to think about, yes, maybe, I disagree. I think economics, preferential treatment would get at many other issues. You'd get poor white kids, poor Asian kids, and I think that would go a long way to creating the kind of racial diversity that you're talking about. But let's not forget the vast majority of kids are not getting in to these elite schools, and they're not getting in because they're not prepared.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now we're going to move to our audience Q&A part. So we're going to have our members of the DPU line up over here. They're going to hold the microphone. If you'd like to come up and ask a question, please do.
Can I turn my chair a little?
Thank y'all both so much for being here. Both of you talked a little bit about school choice programs. I'm from North Carolina. We've put a lot of money into school choice programs recently. But with a lot of these charter schools and private schools, they don't offer things like transportation, which inhibits a lot of low-income and BIPOC students from attending these schools. In addition, we've seen that once we take away the wealth cap or the income cap for private school vouchers, that a lot of those vouchers actually end up going to students who are already in these private schools, and it just subsidizes their education that they're already covering. So we've talked a lot about like equity of opportunity, and sure, these students may have equal opportunity in theory. However, how do we make sure that these parents know that they can send their students to these schools and have an actual equal opportunity of being able to get their students to these schools?
You're right. In different states, you might have different school choice laws. You might have education savings accounts. You might have vouchers. You might have charters. Some of the states, the vouchers and ESAs are means tested, so it gets around that issue, so it's only available to low-income kids. I think the way that we want to create an ecosystem of choice. In the same way that middle and upper class parents can move to the suburbs or send their kid to a private school, the most vulnerable in our population should have that choice as well. You're right in that a voucher may not cover everything. You know, I think North Carolina is maybe $8,000 or $9,000, forget the exact amount. And there will be some private schools that are higher than that. So it won't solve every problem, but at least we're giving kids and their families a shot. And you know, my hope is that this administration does live up to the expectation that more and more low-income kids in particular are given the right to choose the school of their choice. And there's going to be a big Supreme Court case in a couple of months with an Oklahoma Catholic school that is purported to run a public charter school and receive public funding. That may be a seismic shift as well, in that parents can choose their public dollars and even send them to religious schools. I know that's controversial, but I think this idea, maximize learning opportunities for kids, especially those in low-income populations.
I don't really have much to add to that except to say that I don't have a problem, again, with charter schools. The problem I have is with defunding the other public schools. And I don't want to just create a system that drains all the resources and puts it into the charter schools. So my concern, I agree, I understand what you're talking about, how to get people to go to those charter schools and get parents to know that. But I'm concerned about what happens to all the kids who are left behind. You know, you talk about like all these kids who you deal with who you want them to learn in the environment you've created, but what happens to the 80 to 90% of other kids who are out there who don't have those schools? I think we're missing the point when we focus on charter schools. We're failing. We're abandoning our responsibility as a society to educate our population in general. And so we create a few pockets where we say, okay, we'll deal with these kids. We'll create some opportunities for these. We'll let the motivated entrepreneurial parents be able to opt their way out of it. But we're relegating everybody else to a substandard system of education. And that's unacceptable.
So would you say to a 22-year-old mom who has a 5-year-old who needs to go to kindergarten in a system where single-digit percentages of kids are reading at proficiency, would you tell that mom of 22-year-old mom that she has to send her kid?
I never said that. I have no problem with charter schools. My problem, I'm saying that every school, every child should have the opportunity to go to a good school.
Yes.
Not just the kids who go to a charter school.
Yes.
Not just the parents who are motivated. The way we fund our schools in the first place with local property taxes is problematic in that it encourages racial disparities and economic disparities, which are also correlated, so that a lot of kids will never be able to get a good education because they just happen to be born in the wrong zip code.
I agree with you, and I think the best lever is to give those families choice as we're thinking about how to revamp the overall system. But that's been going on for
Or
decades
just fix the
now.
overall system.
Okay. We'll move on to our next audience Q&A.
Thank you again, obviously, for being here. I'm from Watertown, Massachusetts, and I went to a public high school. I had the opportunity to serve on a hiring committee for a new history teacher at my school. And we sat in on a bunch of interviews. Dozens of people came through, and there were only a handful of people of color who applied to the position for whatever reason. And we had one person on the panel who was also a person of color, and she said, in the end, when we had to pick who was moving on to the next round, I want her to go through, and the only reasoning she gave was because she was black, and I say that genuinely, and it struck me as very, ruining the whole idea of these policies, when we're picking people solely based off of their race. And I agree with you in that should never be the only factor, and we should obviously pick people who are qualified. And many of the other people on the panel, saw and said, we don't think that this person has the necessary qualifications, whatever, to make a long story short. In the end, she did move on. However, she was not hired for the position. But I guess how should administrators in schools, or really any hiring agency or group, assess these situations without only considering race, when it's true that some of these, a lot of the other opinions are, focusing on the race factor only? I guess, I don't know if that's a clear question or not.
I can't remember if it was Elena Kagan or which one of the dissenting opinions in the Supreme Court case, who stated that race should never be the only factor in making a decision for college admissions, but neither should it be the only factor that you cannot consider. And that's what we essentially have created in our country today, that race is the only factor you cannot consider. You can consider everything else except someone's race. You can consider their socioeconomic status. You can consider their family history. You can consider how much money they gave to the school. You can consider which of their parents and grandparents went to the school. You can consider whether they're an athlete or not. You can consider whether they play music or not. But you can't talk about or even consider their race. And I would understand that, but there's this whole sort of ahistorical reasoning that people need to sort of pull apart here. The reason why we were having this conversation is because people have deconstructed what took place 60, 50 years ago when we had the civil rights movement in the first place. The reason why we're doing this is because we forgot what happened 160 years ago when we had the Reconstruction era. We have these laws in place because black people were enslaved, black people were segregated, black people were excluded, black people couldn't come to schools like Dartmouth College and Harvard. They couldn't go to even other schools that were not Ivy League schools because of racial discrimination. And not just black people, but other groups of people as well. We have a history of discrimination in our country. Black people weren't even guaranteed the right to vote until 1965. Women couldn't open up a credit card in their own name until 1974. LGBTQ people couldn't marry in this country until 10 years ago. People with disabilities didn't have rights protected in the workplace until 1990. This is a relatively new phenomenon of inclusion in our society. And we're supposed to pretend that everybody's equal after one group of people who are straight, white, Christian, male, able people have been empowered for hundreds of years and nobody else has a head start? That's just not fair. And so I understand exactly what you're saying. You don't want to have this example, one person is giving what you consider to be preferential treatment. But I also want us to step back and figure out, how do we create an equitable system so we understand how do we figure our way out of this? How do we create opportunities so everybody can have those opportunities? And we can't just look at this one example and say, well, this is problematic, and not look at the history that got us there.
I mean, I generally would concur. I mean, the issue with what the scenario you just described is that teacher, had that person been hired, just imagine what the perception of her, if everyone knew that this person was only elevated because of race. I mean, the way you make it sound is that this person didn't measure up on all the other criteria, and that's harmful. That's just harmful. It's harmful to the idea of DEI because this is the perception, right? It's unfortunate.
Why is it not harmful when Pete Hegseth gets chosen as being the Secretary of Defense with no qualifications? He's just a random white guy. Why do black people have to feel guilty when an unqualified black person gets hired, but white people don't feel guilty when unqualified white people get hired all the time? Donald Trump is the most unqualified president in the history of America. And the first time he had no qualifications, the second time he was at least qualified, but he was the first convicted criminal to be elected president. That would have been disqualifying for any other person in the country who was of a different race.
Right. I don't support unqualified people getting hired for any position.
I'm sorry, I get passionate about these things.
I think we have time for one more audience Q&A question.
So I'm in a class about affirmative action right now, and as we were reviewing the SFFA opinion, one of the main arguments from the majority is that in a finite, zero-sum game, preferences for one group, whether it's, for this we can make it like a philosophical argument, legacies, kids on the dean's list, children of faculty, or racial groups, is inherently discriminatory to other groups. So I'm curious if either of you think that, given where we are today, is reverse discrimination necessary to combat the discrepancies and inequality that's present in the United States currently?
Well, if you're looking at me, so I don't believe in the term reverse discrimination. I don't think that is what we're talking about. I think what we're talking about is creating a system where we allow people who have not been included in society to be included. I don't consider that reverse discrimination. If there's a group of people who have been, if you have a party, and I don't know what fraternity you might be a part of, but if you're, I was a Sig Ap when I was here, because it was a track frat back in the day. If we had a party at Sig Ap back in the day, and we didn't invite anybody who was from Oklahoma, and then suddenly one day we decide, okay, we'll invite somebody in from Oklahoma just because they're from Oklahoma. Are we discriminating against other people who are not from Oklahoma? We're just kind of compensating for the fact that we have not included people from this group before. So I don't think that's unfair to people not from Oklahoma because we pick somebody from Oklahoma to come in. And I think when we talk about it in context that doesn't deal with race, it's easier for people to understand. But when we talk about race, everybody gets all upset about it because we don't want to deal with the history of where this country started.
And my feeling, I do think it's an interesting framework that you put forth. In a finite group where you have thousands of people applying, how do you choose? And I think it's a fair question. My default would be, as I said before, would be economic class. Because my hope would be that would, again, I think most Americans would agree that if you're going to create any kind of preferential treatment, it would go to the most economically disadvantaged kids who are working the hardest and striving. And so I think if we did that first, before all the other legitimate reasons you want to fill out a class for a whole bunch of reasons, but I think economic disadvantage would be, if I were in your class, that's what I would be advocating for.
What an incredible debate. Please join me in thanking Ian Rowe, Keith Boykin, Margaret, and Alexander for providing us with such an engaging conversation. All right, bear with me for 1 second. All right, before we close, please take a few minutes to answer this poll so that we can see if anyone's mind has changed as a result of this debate. While you are all doing that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Having supporters like you is what helps the DPU to continue its mission of promoting the free exchange of discourse on our campus. Thank you to Keith Boykin and Ian Rowe again for being such great debate partners, and I would like to thank the Office of the President for its continuous support. Lastly, I would like to use this opportunity to announce our next few events. At 7 p.m. on Thursday, March 6th, we will be hosting our finally weekly conversation of the term on the topic of climate change in the room Carson 60. Next term, we look forward to hosting a debate on the topic of abortion policies in America and co-hosting the Hunger Games series with the Rockefeller Center. With that said, the results of the debate poll are in, and 64.3% of you do believe that DEI policies are an appropriate way of addressing inequality in America, while 25% of you have shared that you do not believe that they are an appropriate way of addressing inequality in America. And finally, 10.7% of you are unsure of whether or not DEI policies are an appropriate way of addressing inequality in America. I'll ask that you all stay seated while our speakers exit the room. And once again, please join me in giving Ian Rowe and Keith Boykin a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.